Well, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm greatly honored to introduce Cammie. She has been with the Carnegie Foundation for several years, and I'm going to read her bio, but I'm just going to talk a little bit of a personal story. So we were out in North Carolina this summer, and she was giving a workshop, and we had a wonderful interaction about minority serving institutions and the work we do here at University of New Mexico, working with different communities across the region. And so she was gracious enough to accept my invitation to come out and be a keynote. And so we're just really glad that you made it out. First time to New Mexico, so we did take her to have some Mexican food last night, and she made it to Old Town and did some shopping. So
yeah, I did it all.
Green or red?
Yeah.
Oh.
She did both. Christmas.
I'm from Texas, so I don't know. Like, hey, I come in peace.
Well, let me read the bio because I think it's really important to kind of introduce. So Cammie Jones Friedrichs is director of the Carnegie Elective for Community Engagement. Cammie is originally from Dallas, Texas, and spent 18 years in higher education in nonprofit leadership, continuing paving the way for social justice and civic engagement. She's a first-generation college student with a BS in kinesiology from the University of Texas at Austin, Troy's alma mater, and MA in higher education and administration from Louisiana State University, University at UNM, and now is currently a doctorate student at the University of Southern Miss. So it just gives me great pleasure and great honor to have you here, so please welcome Cammie.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for coming back, because usually when lunch break comes and we're at a conference, people don't return. So thank you for coming back this afternoon and connecting with me. I'm really looking forward to not only talking about some things that I've seen nationally with the community engagement classification, but also learning from you. I really enjoyed the panel this morning, was taking so many notes. So once again, kudos to all of you for the work that you do. I was just really proud to just hear about your efforts, and so it really has provided a little more insight for me about this work. So I'm going to get into it because we have a lot to do this afternoon. As Tim, Sarah, my name is Cammie Jones Friedrichs. I'm the director for the Carnegie Elective Classification for Community Engagement. And on behalf of the Carnegie Foundation and ACE, I first just want to thank you so much for having me today. Thank you to the University of New Mexico, as well as the provost, and the wonderful staff under Tim's leadership for really welcoming me today and being able to try green and red chili. So it's been such a warm experience for me thus far. I'm so happy to be here today to talk about the impact of community engagement from a national lens due to community engagement classification and lessons learned from the data. But I also am going to do my best in the little time I have to focus on community engagement and its impact within our minority serving institutions, specifically with Hispanic serving institutions as well, and how we can utilize community engagement as a tool to break down barriers. That's our theme today. And how that can lead to inclusive, comprehensive processes, programs, and initiatives that lead to transformational engagement with our communities. So today, showing the agenda, today I'm going to give a quick overview of the community engagement classification. I never want to make the assumption that people know what we're all about. I always say the application is like a maze. Those that are going through it or have, you are brave friends, and you know that there's a lot that goes into that process, but there's a lot that you can learn from it that really impacts the work that you do on your campuses and in your communities. So I'm going to talk about that really quickly, but we will have a panel that'll go into it a little bit more. In addition to talking about the community engagement classification, I really want to talk about how we at ACE decided that we needed to break barriers because of the data that we were getting from our minority serving institutions about how we can build better inclusive practices with the application and how that aligns with the work that you are already doing and modeling in the field. I'll then go into community engagement as a high impact practice. I was happy to hear about that this morning, and I think that's really important if we're thinking about the future in regards to this work and how we show up. And then after that, just some best practices that we should consider and more than anything, leaning into the work based on your institutional type, telling your story of community engagement, not from a space of deficit, because that is really important in regards to this work, but really leaning into your story and season and engagement that is enriched with empowerment, truth, acknowledgement of groundbreaking practices. So that's a lot, but we're gonna do our best to get through all of that. The first thing I always like to do is first give you a glimpse of me. A lot of the stuff you already heard from Tim. If anything, this slide deck is just showing that I come in peace because I'm from the Southwest, proud to be from the Southwest. All of my education has come from the South. And it really highlights more than anything that I am a first-gen student. I am a Pell Eldredge student. And when I was going through the undergraduate process, in a lot of ways, I am the story that we talk about so much in this field, about that student whose life was changed because of engaged learning. That's the reason why I've been in this field for 18 years, was because I stumbled across a service learning class at UT Austin. And that's basically how the story began. And it really saved my life in a lot of ways. And so when I do this work, I always say it's not a professional thing, it's a personal thing. It's an honor to do this work and to work alongside communities. I don't take it for granted that community members are willing to open their spaces to us, and neither should we. So it really is a topic that is really close to my heart. So I would say community engaged work is heart space work. So the first thing I'm gonna do is just talk about the community engagement classification. For some of you, you probably have seen this before if you've been to any of our webinars, but I'm sorry, I want to just quickly give an overview of the work that we do at Carnegie. So in regards to the community engagement classification, it has been around the field for close to 2 decades now, and it has helped establish common standards of practice for institutionalizing community engagement in American higher education. And it really has helped institutions understand how to gather and present accurate data about their engagement efforts. And the classification, though it is a long process, not as long as it used to be, it allows for institutions to recognize the work that they do, but their commitment and excellence in regards to community engagement. As such, as those of you know who are going through this process, it requires a large body of evidence of meaningful and sustained institutional investment. And the institutions that are successful in this process, they really do a great job with demonstrating that community engagement is not only enacted, but it's supported, which means that it's sustained. And when we're talking about enactment and support, that means there's a commitment to the people who are doing the work. So when I was looking at the panel this morning and also seeing the students in the audience and community members, these are the key people-centered individuals that make this all work. It's commitment to faculty, staff, and students. Institutional commitment and excellence in the application is demonstrated through systems, structures, and resources that are deep, pervasive, and integrated. And so through this evidence in the community engagement classification, it really has allowed us to gain insight on the exemplar models of community engagement in the field. But I have a why now slide, and the reason why I call it why now is because we decided that we need to go through a revision process. And the reason why we went through this, and you can see this right here, is that a lot of growth has occurred in the 2 decades in regards to which this work is happening in the classification. Yet we noticed that there were people who were missing in the story, especially specific institutional types, those being minority serving institutions. They were missing in the story, as well as community colleges, and it was a barrier because these institutional types are really critical in regards to educating the next generation of community leaders. And they were forgotten in the community engagement narrative, which was unfortunate because minority serving institutions are the foundation to this work. So we felt that it was time to do a revision. And MSIs did not mince words for us in regards to what we needed to do better in regards to the revision process, and create one that is inclusive to amplify the stories and practices that's happening within your institutions. As I've shared, MSI leaders, they are pioneers in the field, and especially when we're thinking about community engagement. And it was MSIs who actually created access and interest and inclusive spaces for minority students to even have the opportunity to learn, as well as educating the community. And so why weren't we doing enough work to amplify those stories? And what could we do to support and continue to advance the vision and mission of these institutions? And as you see here, it just kind of shows you a breakdown. And Tim talked about this earlier at the beginning of the 368 current campuses, as well as how many minority-serving institutions, which for some folks, they would see that number and say, oh, that's a large amount. But when you think about it, and if you do an overview, just a general Google search, you'll see that there is a plethora of minority-serving institutions. So though this number is helpful, there's more work that can be done. And though we're in the 2026 cycle, it was the 2024 application cycle data, which I want to share was a very small cycle because everyone deferred to 2026. You had an option to do 24, 26. Everyone was like, we're doing 2026. But there were a few folks who went through the 2024 cycle, and it really shows you the breakdown in regards to the institutional types. And we did see growth, of course, with Hispanic serving institution and HBCUs. But with it being a small cycle, we were like, okay, let's take a step back a little bit here, and let's start asking the hard questions, because though the data, if we go back here, and it shows incremental growth in regards to whom was participating, as I shared, there were several institutions that were missing that are doing the work and are not partaking in the process, although their models of engagement are significant and needed in the field, and we wanted to know why. And so now that the classification had grown and we were part of ACE, we decided that we need to dig a little bit deeper into this work. And we decided that we needed to, and I say we, because it was a collective of individuals from minority-serving institutions that created an ad hoc committee, and we came together with two guiding questions. And the first was, why are there relatively fewer minority-serving institutions applying for and receiving a classification, given their historic and ongoing commitments to this work? And then also, how can we make this a more streamlined process for institutions to participate in? I was telling some of my colleagues earlier today that I got a lot of feedback from the field as to how they liked the application and what we can do better. And a lot of the things were around, it was too long. We don't have the resources. You can't expect everyone's story to fit within these specific questions that you have. So not only were we thinking about who was missing, but we also were thinking about, which I'm sure you all experienced with your programs and initiatives, how do we make this more practical and efficient for everyone's voices to be heard and seen in this work? And that's what led to us doing a revision process, which was of and by the field. As I said, we had a committee. They met for over 6 weeks in 2023, and these objectives are really important for us because these objectives would guide us, being a revision team, to really think about our process. And it would lead us to really think about not only how do we support minority-serving institutions, but how do we acknowledge them? How do we acknowledge that our past frameworks were creating barriers in the field? And that's from the formatting, that's from the framing of our work, and we needed to find a better way to where we could have stories and lessons and best practices be brought forth into the field, because there isn't one way to do this work, as we learned this morning. There's so many innovative ways in regards to how community engagement can show up. Now, I went through that really quickly, but I thought it was important to first just really talk about the community engagement classification and why we went through this revision process. Because when we think about the themes that I shared on the objective slide, it focused on access, it focused on interest, and it also focused on the support of minority-serving institutions. And those values and objectives that I shared in this process that we went through for the 2026 application are very similar to the values in which minority-serving institutions hold. The reason why I started with our revisions was because this process showed us that our data acknowledges and is aware of your impact, but we still have some gaps in the work. And there are better ways that we can collaborate and support your work even better. So in order to do that, we need to clear the barriers in regards to creating access for you to participate in this work. We need to create pathways. And so those who are participating in this cycle probably are saying it's a little different than 2020 and 2015. And that's because of the data and the feedback that we received. But more than anything, the themes from the data in a lot of ways aligns with the themes with minority-serving institutions in regards to why you do this work, how do you do this work, how do you sustain the work. And so now that I've shared how we went through this we went through this revision process in a quick turnaround, I now want to kind of talk about accountability and access. And I think it's important that before we go forward and talk about the implications of this revision for the field, that we take a moment to step back and go into time and really think about the origins of MSIs and their impact first, which then can guide us through how do we move forward in the field of community engagement? How do we actually break those barriers and implement sustained best practices that amplify the stories of your work and your institutions? The classification, as I always say, though, is like a badge of honor. It's not the only way that you can show your work. It's one piece to a large puzzle. The themes that I talked about here actually can be translated into your spaces when we're thinking about collective action work. So when we're thinking about the changes in our programs and initiatives and projects, thinking about who is present, who is missing, accountability, resources. You need resources. Everyone was talking about this morning. Yes, you need resources to do this work. But more than anything, we want to encourage you to share your work because we do so much, yet the field needs to know it. We need to hear it. So now that I've kind of talked about the revision process, I just want to quickly show you a timeline in regards to the Minority Servant Institution movement. And this is a timeline that was created by one of our partners in the field, the Center for Minority Servant Institutions at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And this timeline is really imperative because it highlights all the moving pieces that occurred for education to become accessible to minorities in the United States. It required collective action work, community engagement, leadership, funding, legislation, and more to get to the point to where we are, where we see this boom in minority servant institutions in the US. But one of the things that's really important about this quick overview of this timeline is that the institutions that are considered minority servants, so that's historical Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, Hispanic servant institutions, Asian American, Native American, and Pacific Islander servant institutions. All these institutions have come together and they've carved out a unique niche in the nation of serving the needs of low-income students of color. Your institutions are breaking barriers every single day, and it's important that we remember what it took to get to this point so that we can reconnect with our why and a critical purpose of the work and the impact that you provide for society, which was shared earlier on the panel. And this timeline and research, actually let me go back to this really quick. This timeline and this research shows just how critical minority servant institutions are to their communities, the students, faculty, staff, the country, and also the world. Because minority servant institutions provide a diverse environment of faculty, staff, and students, which I heard about, and I hope some of you were here this morning. Like, it was just wonderful hearing the breakdown of the different institutions on the panel, and you see through their stories just how minority servant institutions enhance student learning outcomes. They cultivate leadership opportunities and skills. They offer role models through their faculty members and their administration on campus. They provide programs of study that challenge students. They address deficiencies that may result from the lack of preparation in primary and secondary schools. And they prepare students to succeed in the workforce, which we saw a lot in the statistics this morning. And that translates even into graduate and professional school. So more than anything, minority servant institutions provide hope, which is something we need right now. Hope, skills, and tools to break barriers and fight against society's inequitable practices, against the student populations and communities which you work alongside with. If anything, they uplift, they teach, and they provide pride. They give voice and a space to learn. So I share all this first to give you hope and uplift you, but also to remind you that you do a lot. But it requires a lot from those who are leading in their institutions with this work. And so what you'll see here in these next slides is it kind of gives you an overview in regards to the growth of your institutions in the country right now. And one of the things I want to share about these next few graphs that I show is that this is data from 2021, and it's from a research project called the Minority Servant Institution Data Project. This was launched in March 2023, and it offers dashboards with data on minority servant institutions' eligibility, funding status, characteristics, enrollment, and graduation metrics. So it really shows you the impact very quickly. And on this graph right here, it really gives you just an overview of all the minority servant institutions from 2021. It breaks down the total of the location, as well as those who have multiple designations. as well as how they're funded and more. This is a very, I would say, helpful tool in an interactive data space to also let you see what your peers are doing. And as I shared, this is from 2021. But what's really important about this is that it's showing the growth in the country in regards to not only minority-serving institutions, but also emerging minority-serving institutions, and how you are the gateway to higher education. And here is a glance in regards to Hispanic-serving institutions. So similar to that slide that Tim showed where it was like a full map of the US and it was showing all the dots as to where everyone's located in regards to their classification, this graph kind of gives you that information as well for HSIs. And it's very helpful because it really is showing the growth and development of HSIs in the United States, where they're located, but also the degrees that are conferred, which is at a high rate, and the colleges with the highest Latinx population as well. And just to compare, you see it here with historically Black colleges and universities. And this graph right here just really gives you an overview to similar data that you saw in the previous slides, but it also connects with the timeline that I shared in regards to the minority-serving institution movement and how segregation in this country impacted the locations in regards to who was educated and how they still are serving those populations within their communities to this very day. And you also, once again, see the growth that's occurring within these institutions. And then the last slide here is from HACU. This is the Hispanic Association for Colleges and Universities, and this is a little more recent, I would say, from 2022 to 2023. And this really breaks down Hispanic serving institutions nationally and where we stand. And it also shows where things are headed in regards to emergent institutions. And what you can get from all of this is what I would say is that you're playing a critical role in higher education, maybe more than you know. The landscape is far and wide in regards to who's being educated and how you're uplifting and providing opportunities for underrepresented students in this country. So there's a lot of work that's being done. And so why would I share all these slides? And I think it's important to see these graphs. I wish I had more time to break it down because graphs in here, but I'm not gonna do that. But I think what's really important is that what we can see here from these graphs is that the community in which you're a part of, minority serving institutions, are impacting and educating the future. They're sustaining community value, from funding to growth to economic development to the degrees that are conferred that you saw on the previous slides, as well as the populations that you're serving. These campuses not only have a purpose, but profound impact in the field and the world. And I think it's important to sometimes take a pause, even for myself in this work, where sometimes I kind of get lost with the doom, and I'm like, oh my God, what are we doing? And then when I see the data gives me hope. It lets me know that I have a network, I have a group of people who are doing this work, and how can we connect with each other to continue to uplift our students and our institutions, and as I said earlier, amplify high quality standards of practice of community engagement. And one area where we're seeing that, because I want to transition a little bit, is with Hispanic serving institutions. Based on research from HACU and Rutgers University, there are a lot of ways in which Hispanic serving institutions impact higher education. And as you see in the slide, like I said, research student again, all the content and where I got it from, there's a lot of things that your institutions do. You provide graduation rates that are increasing annually. You promote cultural identity and a sense of belonging, which our panelists shared. You provide services that have led to Latino students and immigrant students, which we talked about. Like, it's not a monolith here. There's a lot of complexity and diversity in regards to this group and engaging them in community-based practices. But when they have the opportunity to participate in community-based activities and service learning projects, that fosters leadership development and leads to, as the field likes to say, soft skills, which I feel like no skill is soft, every skill is hard to gain, okay? So it leads to these skills that are transformational and transferable into the workforce, into their communities. And it contributes to the diversity of the US, which then leads to promotion of economic advancement But more than anything, even though I focus on HSIs, both HSIs and MSIs as a whole, they really play a vital role into the nation's economy by elevating the workforce, giving opportunities for disadvantaged populations to see themselves, see their value, know that there's opportunities to advance and go into graduate and professional school. You provide that with the work that you do. And so now that we see the impact and we understand it, how does that translate to community engagement? Because that's kind of where, when I work with schools, there's like this disconnect. It's like, yeah, we do all these things. And I think it was Jenna over here. She was talking about how like the students have assets and sometimes they don't talk about it. I feel like minority serving institutions do that a lot too. You forget about your assets. You forget about your impact and what you do. And so my purpose today is to remind you of that. And I think that's really important for us right now. We know that what your campuses can do. HSIs provide, as well as MSIs, the skills, the tools, the education, and the voice and opportunity for the next generation to have a sense of belonging and purpose. But what the data has shown in the community engagement classification is that you have to sustain it. So if you're going to implement it, that means that you have to have best practices, which means honest conversations, resources, infrastructure, and more than anything, high impact practices. So as we explore some things in these next few slides, I want you to think about, what high impact practices and assets are you already doing? I never want you to think that you're not doing it. Like, sure, there's things that we can all do better, but I want you to think about what you're currently doing well, where you can advance, what you can implement that allows for students to achieve some of the things that we've talked about already, but also will come forth in these slides. And what we've learned from the data is that community engagement is thriving in minority serving institutions and is breaking barriers. And one way is the fact that it's a high impact practice. So as I shared, I never make the assumption, that everyone knows like what's a HIP, So in regards to high impact practices, this was something that was researched by the American Association for Colleges and Universities. They actually have an annual conference in January, FYI, if you're interested. But what's really great about the AACU is that they really have advanced the field in thinking thoroughly about high impact practices, what they look like, and how they're feasible and practical to different institution types. So it's not a one size fits all for everyone, but these are some best practices that can advance community engagement within your institution. And so in regards to high impact practices, they are based on evidence of significant educational benefits for students who participate in them. So this includes students from historically underserved groups, students that your campuses serve. These practices take many forms, as you see here in the second bullet point, and it really depends on a lot of internal and external characteristics and research and resources as well. So based on this evidence, some of the community engaged high impact practices that we see is service learning, internships and field experiences, global learning, community-based practices, civic engagement, community-based engagement. What you'll see here in this second bullet point, this is a lot of the research that we ask for and evidence in our community engagement classification, which allows us to understand what's happening in the field, which is why we need you in this space, because some of this could become outdated if we don't know the innovative practices that you're implementing in your campuses. And another piece that's really important about high impact practices is this intentionality in regards to not only their time on campus, but also really thinking about their future, because these are future community members. These not even future, they are community members. I should correct myself with that. Because these evidence-based practices really allow for students to be involved and to evolve in a lot of ways. It allows them to enjoy higher levels of learning and success, and it leads to impacting their communities that they're a part of within their institutions, external to their institutions, and also the communities that they'll join in the future. And so specifically, if we know about these high impact practices, I wanted to talk a little bit about how do we see this in HSIs as well as MSIs, because we encourage you to do them, and sometimes the field makes it seem like it's so easy to lean into these practices. The evidence shows the longstanding impact that community engagement has on minority students, on your campuses. But there's a lot of work that has to happen in regards to breaking the barriers, to making it accessible, especially when we think about the academic, the personal and professional success that our students want to have. And so this is where your institutions take a step back, but also lean into thinking about the ways in which you can advance community engagement practices based on some of the high impact practices that were shared on the previous slide. So in regards to HSIs and your role in community engagement, based on some recent research, we have found that there's a lot of positive effects for underserved students that participate in community engagement, specifically in comparison with students from the same group that do not participate. So connection with graduation, workforce development, professional and graduate school. It also leads to strengthening their problem-solving skills and their content acquisition skills. Like I said, people love to call it soft skills. These are hard skills. And it's great that they get exposed to this earlier on so that they can practice and learn and continue to evolve into this work. And then the other piece that's really important is that it contributes to a word that the field loves to talk about quite a bit, and that's retention and graduation rates. But also more than anything, for me, what sticks out with this, based on recent research, is that Hispanic serving institutions who embrace these practices of community engagement, which is a meaningful tool, by the way, it leads to institutional transformation and continuous improvement. One of the things I always tell people when they go through the community engagement classification process is that there's no perfect way of fully doing this work, because we're human beings and we change and we bring a lot into the space. So it's always a space for continuous improvement. There's no perfect application, but there are best practices that you should follow if you want to create a respectful, mutual, reciprocal, community engaged campus or community or project or initiative or program or class. There are best practices that we really need to lean into, because when we lean into that, that is where the barriers are broken. That is where we really lean into this deep and pervasive language of this work in the field. Because MSIs enroll a substantial share of minority students, as I shared earlier. Many of these students may not even have the opportunity to attend college, and you open a door for them. And through continuous improvement and development, your institutions are really critical to realizing our nation's higher education and workforce goals. And with the knowledge with whom you serve and integrating high impact practices, it really leads to the words that we like to say: innovation, transformation, not transactional work. It leads to sustained practices for students and different pathways to find their sense of belonging within the communities that they join at your institutions. And so how does this translate? I think that's one thing that I get a lot for folks, and I'm going to do a few case studies of Hispanic serving institutions that have integrated community engagement. They're classified, and they've gone through, I would say, a few institutional changes around what we like to call servingness. And one institution that I want to focus on is Fresno State. Fresno State is an institution in California, Northern California, and they are a classified campus. They are both an HSI and an ANAPZ, and they're a very diverse institution, very interesting because they have a high percentage of first-gen students as well as Pell-eligible students. But what's really important about their community engaged work is that everything they do is connected to strengthening their community, which is Central Valley, California. So their full focus of community engagement is all about Central Valley, California. And because of that, it has led to them having specific anchor goals that are connected to high impact practices that are implemented in teaching, learning, and research, curricular and co-curricular engagement throughout their institution. And so some of the things that they focus on in regards to their work is to serve and address regional issues. So they are really focused on education, food insecurity, economic development. So it's interesting when you think about going a few slides back, thinking about what your institutions provide for your students, and then these institutions are turning around and providing similar themes with the community, because in a lot of ways the community is a part of your classroom. And so then it provides an opportunity for students from the moment they enter campus to think about the culture of not only, I wouldn't say giving back to campus, but more about serving and working alongside your community. And the last piece is that at Fresno State, one of the things they do a good job with is that they inspire their students to really think about, like, this isn't a one-time thing. This isn't like a 4-year plan where you're gonna learn about community engagement, that's it, you're gonna move forward and not think about it. This is life-giving work. And these values lead to you respecting and engaging with your community in a transformational manner. And that's really important because when you think about the definition of community engagement from Carnegie, which is really important right here. When you look at this definition, it's a reminder of how impactful and important community engagement is, but also how HSIs are already aligned with these critical models and best practices and stories of engagement. Community engagement is not just something that impacts an institution. It impacts a region, it impacts a community, it impacts a state because you are educating a community within your classrooms. You're providing resources and spaces to think, explore, and reimagine collective action work, which is the definition that we follow. And as the definition highlights, the initiatives and programs in which you implement for your students, your faculty, and community partners to collaborate on are impacted by the needs of the community. That's one of the most important things I always tell folks. You have to have community identified needs. It cannot be something that you just create and say, yeah, that's what we're gonna do. That does not lead to reciprocity and a mutually beneficial exchange of knowledge. That doesn't lead to assets-based learning, which leads to validation and legitimizing everyone who's involved in this process, which is really imperative to this work. And in a lot of ways, if you look at this slide right here, it also is a reminder that the classification aligns with what you already do in your local and your states, as well as the nation. So when you think about local, state, nation, the world, as I shared from the beginning, your communities, your institutions are already leaders in regards to this work. The classification is only 2 decades old. It came after the creation of your institutions. And so I always like to remind schools about that. It's like, you're doing it, you're leading it, so you are the ones that can guide us to how do we address critical societal issues? How do we contribute to the public good? How do we advance scholarship and research and creative activity? And a lot of that is connected with the work that's needed in the communities, but also high impact practices. So I want to wrap up a little bit and really just explore what's next. What lessons can be learned from what we've explored? And also, how do we continue to embrace this practice as our communities change? I'm hearing stories of apathy from students, lack of research. Like, how do we continue to create these pathways to this work when there's so much change that's happening within our community engaged space? And one of the things I want to do is talk about one of my institutions. I'm gonna say my favorite, but I love to highlight them. It's Miami-Dade College. They are a Hispanic serving institution. If you remember that slide I shared earlier, they are the highest degree granting institution for Latinx students. And what's important about Miami-Dade is that they are a 2015 classified campus. And there are actually only a handful of community colleges across the nation to hold the designation. And they recently had an article come out in 2023. And their director had a really great quote as to why community engagement is important to HSIs. And what he shared was, through his work at the institution, he has evidence that community and civic engagement helps students to persist in college, graduate, prepares them for the workforce, so what the research is saying, and encourages students to be more informed, engaged, compassionate community members and change makers. I love that quote. Yet, as we know, it's not so simple to enter the community engagement space. We have to create pathways for our students and colleagues to participate. And so what Miami-Dade has done is they've offered several strategies for HSIs and other MSIs to consider when doing community engagement work and how to do it well. And this is a community college, okay? And they are doing fantastic work because they are leaning into the needs of their community, first by leveraging cultural competence. So as we were talking about earlier this morning on the panel, that assets building approach is really critical, not just with your students, but with your communities. Your community members are educators, they're leaders. Their work should be validated and legitimized and people-centered, which connects with intentionality. You know, you benefit from establishing structured programs and initiatives that foster community engagement, but it's something that should not just be housed within one space. You want to see that integration between curricular and co-curricular spaces. But in order to do the work, you need infrastructure, and I don't know if I have an answer to that. Like, I remember when I worked in institutions and I was always begging for money and, I don't know, bartering, everything you could imagine. Like, I was doing whatever I could do to do the work, and it's still that issue in this field. How do you talk to your upper administration to have dedicated offices and staff, which we'll talk about on the panel, to support engagement efforts that are in line with institution priorities? Another piece is this reciprocal partnership piece. I know at the end of the panel this morning they were talking about the importance of partnerships and how meaningful they are for engagement. But one of the things we acknowledge in our application is that partnerships is hard. It's hard to do. Like, we have to be very honest about this. But there's a lot that can be learned with partnership development that is strong and reciprocal with your communities and aligns with the community identified needs. And then the last piece, which we don't like to do in the field a lot, is assessment. You don't know where you're going if you don't assess. You don't know what's working well and what's not if you don't continuously assess the work. That is very vital to HSIs, but also minority serving institutions as well. Because once you understand what you're doing with your work and the impact, it leads to further commitment to not only your students, but your communities and your faculty and staff who are a part of this process as well. Another piece that's really important to me is I always like to integrate theoretical frameworks in this work. This is one of my favorite frameworks that I always utilize as a leader in this space. And I think in order to do this work effectively and inclusively, I always like to put my community organizer hat on. And I really like to think about this work a little deeper, because community engagement is more than a collection of meetings and numbers and hours and techniques and tools. Like, it's more than that. It's people. It's a place and environment that's made up of diverse people and lived experiences and practices, conditions and values. Our environments that we work in is how we build these practices that we love to talk about, but we have to take a step back and remember that you have to invite and create space for diverse voices. And you have to learn to be comfortable with that. You have to understand the dynamics of race and power and injustice in your communities and why there's barriers. Why are there barriers within our institutions? Why are there barriers within our communities? Why are there barriers with self-study processes? Which then leads to the strategies for inviting and listening. And this was something that I had to do quite a bit when I went through the 2026 revision cycle. It wasn't hard for me because I didn't take it personally. I'm one of those people where it's like, tell me what's going on. But you do that so that you can build the trust and the commitment in the work. You have to know that there's going to be disagreements, but at the end of the day, what is your goal and what is your why? And for me, it was to make sure the minority serving institution and revision process were seen and heard, and it wasn't just lip service. And so it means really leaning in and encouraging and enabling change no matter what. So once you know your why and you acknowledge it and you create spaces for people to be seen and heard, it leads to bringing underrepresented voices into the space, and that's what leads to sustained change that we always want to talk about and lean into, but it's not an easy thing to do. This last slide kind of connects with what I was just talking about. I wanted to kind of lean into this coalition building. So we talked about it from an HSI space. We talked about it from a more theoretical space, but then these are just lessons I learned from the revision process that I think are really translatable to the work that we do within our institutions. And it means being open to generative dialogue. And that's a lot of work to do. You know, having diverse voices at the table, you gotta create space. You have to make sure that you're amplifying different voices so you can understand what the needs are, what is practical, what is feasible, and what's not. So that you're not promising things that you can't do. You also want to be transparent in this space of community engagement and reimagine strategies. As I shared earlier, the revision process happened after 20 years. You know, and so I definitely hit some barriers of why are we changing things? Not everyone likes change. But if you want to revitalize the work that we're doing and connect with the best practices of the field, then it means answering the hard questions. It means talking about the hard things. And it allows for deep introspection. It allows for the space to implement feedback and share updates, and more than anything, have honest storytelling and find those common themes that are going to lead to a shared commitment to best practices in this work. And I can tell you that for me, going into this process, which I feel is definitely replicable in other networks, it really led to new partnerships that I was very surprised to be a part of with higher education organizations and institutions. It led to revitalized relationships with field pioneers. It gave us heightened hope with the work, because sometimes we're just so deep in the data and the projects, we sometimes forget our why. It gave us promise for the field, and it also produced buy-in, because we know you gotta produce the buy-in for some folks when participating in this work. But it also led to the messaging of the work. I think we could do a better job in the field of talking about what we do. You're doing wonderful things. We need to hear about it. So what's next for you and your campuses? That's kind of how I'm leaving things with you today. I will share that barriers are meant to be broken. And for me, the classification was one tool that can be used to guide you through how to break those barriers in a community-engaged space. But as I shared earlier, the community engagement classification is just one spoke in the wheel. It's not the only thing. There are numerous practices, models, and stories, and programs, and initiatives that you're all doing that we don't even know, that deeply embody society's most pressing and complex challenges, and we need to know about that. Because community engagement assists campuses in fulfilling their civic purpose through socially useful knowledge, creation, and dissemination, through democratic values and skills and habits. But I always like to say the difference between community engagement that happens at an institution and an institutional commitment is that it's evidenced through policies, infrastructure, reciprocal partnerships, and deep and pervasive processes, as well as think about your outputs and outcomes. All of which you've heard about today and will continue to hear about today. So as I wrap things up, I always like to leave folks with things to ponder on. Like, I won't have the answers to these things, and you probably won't today, but these are things I'm always thinking about in this work. And one of the things I want you to think about is how you continue to stay steadfast in this work when it can get very hard to do. This work is hard. I feel like I'm sounding negative. I'm not being negative here. It's hard work. It's wonderful work. I love doing this work. I have served in numerous positions in higher ed institutions, and I love it so much, but it can get hard sometimes, or isolating. And it's like, what's gonna keep you in this space to continue to do this work? How are your institutions, if you go through the self-study process or other initiatives and programs, demonstrate the arc of community engagement success and pervasiveness across your institution structures and areas of responsibility? I think another thing that you wanna think about is how you create, honor, and uphold high-quality community engagement partnerships. One of the biggest gaps I've noticed in the community engagement classification is community voice. And it's always shocking to me, because one of the first things I tell every campus is this is a community-engaged application, and yet partnerships are missing. Community voice is missing. So how do you honor partnerships? How do you sustain them? How are they assets-based? And for leaders, how can you provide the resources to sustain an engaged campus? How do you invite that community in? And more than anything, how you listen to your students, faculty, and staff to create an inclusive, generative environment. And that connects with how you amplify your story and your season of engagement. You have a lot of legacy at your institution. There's a lot of legacy in this room, especially, I'm gonna lean to it, minority serving institutions. You are powerful and transformative. You are the foundation in regards to community engagement. And the field doesn't do a great job of sharing that, but I know it. A lot of us know it. And so with knowing that, it's very powerful, it's transformative, and it's needed more than ever to provide hope for a better future, because community is and has always been our superpower. I believe in it. Community has saved my life. Doing this work has saved my life and my students' life. Like, everyone I talk to, like, you're doing this work for a reason. It is our guide to breaking barriers and opening doors. So do not forget about the community, especially during this era that we're in right now. Do not forget about your communities, because your communities is where we hold each other up. It's where we lead to accountability. And also it leads to us uplifting during the most impossible situations. I'm in a history of higher ed class right now, and sometimes I get so down as a millennial. Well, we're always down. I mean, that's just who we are. We love to share that, like, yeah, we're always crying. But for a reason. It's been rough for us. But, yeah. But at the same time, like when I'm reading these articles, so what I'm focusing on is Black women in the academy, specifically in community engagement. And I'm reading these stories from like the 1800s of like what my ancestors had to do to just gain access to higher education. And they had nowhere near the resources that I had or my colleagues have. And I'm like, if they can do what they did to make space for themselves, I can't forget that now with the resources I have. So even when things seem dire, we still have hope because we have community, we have resources, we have networks, we have people that can allow us to lean into our power and give a sense of hope. And you're gonna need that, especially when you're trying to encourage your students and your community members. That's gonna allow you to always go back to your center of groundedness, which is your why of doing this work. So, if anything I can leave you with out of everything I've talked about today, from why the community engagement classification be a helpful tool to fight anti-higher ed rhetoric, to why you're impactful in this space, to the tools and resources that can help you uplift community engagement, do not forget your why in this work. That is what is going to be your compass that you can always go back to continue to lean into this work. And so with that being said, I, student here, gotta show my citations. I just want to wrap up with one call for the field, and this is an opportunity, speaking of like opening doors and more transparency and being of and by the field. We're going through our 2026 cycle right now for our application, and we have a call for reviewers out. I'll tell you that before 2024, this was not the process that we had. This is an opportunity for you, if you're interested, to be a part of a review team and review applications, kind of see what happens behind the scenes, and be the ones that recommend campuses for classification. And so this is something that is happening in the winter with training, and then in the summer, you'll be a part of a group where you review a certain amount of applications, and then you will submit the recommendation for those campuses. So I always tell folks, I am not the person who makes the decision. I don't. The field does. We also want to diversify those who are in the room. We want to make sure that people fully understand not just the classification, but community engaged best practices as well. And so this is another way for us to lower that barrier and allow you to understand what's happening in this field and give us insight and perspective of how we should shift and move forward with this work. So this is an opportunity for anyone, whether you've applied for the classification or not, you're looking for community engaged professionals, faculty, administrators, any employment status or staff are encouraged to apply. And you have to December 1st apply for that. And then to build the field even further, we have a graduate fellow opportunity. So if you know graduate students, I met some today here at University of New Mexico, they're wonderful. If you have graduate students that are interested in this work, they are gonna be a part of the teams this cycle as well. They'll be the ones that help us out with our feedback reports, because each campus that goes through the process actually receives a feedback report, whether you receive classification or not. And so we need graduate fellows to help us with that process. And so if you know of any graduate fellows that may be interested in this work, I will share that these are also paid opportunities, because we believe in equitable practices of paying people for their time and efforts. So this is another opportunity for graduate fellows to understand the field and maybe stay in the field. We have to sustain the field. We saw the impacts of the Great Resignation after summer 2020 and the pandemic. And so we are trying to work on how do we rebuild the field a little bit with fresh faces and voices. And so that's another way that we're doing that. So if you know of anyone, please let me know, email me. There's my contact information right there. Any questions about the classifications is usually on our website. Even if you're not going through this process, I always say download the frameworks, they're free. they're accessible, and in a lot of ways they give you an idea of what you should be thinking about in regards to how to sustain community engagement within your institutions, and this is based on the data that is shared with us from the field. So that is the conclusion of my talk. I don't know if I have time for Q&A, but thank you so much for listening and being a part of this.
You want to take a couple of questions? Or?
Sure, it's 2 o'clock. I don't know. You're the boss.
Yeah. We'll get started. Anybody have any questions? Okay. Yes.
Oh, very nice.
Come on, is there someone else behind me?
I was right behind you.
Yeah.
Okay, hopefully mine's fast.
Oh no.
I can be loud too if it continues feedback. Okay. Thank you so much, and you bring so much experience to those in the room. Something we said in the session before this is that we are all always learning, and I think we're all also aware of that. The question I had, and I'm sorry that I'm not more familiar with the resources on your website already.
Yeah.
You talked before about the importance of evaluation and assessment, and I was wondering if there are resources on that to guide us in how to better embed those kinds of assessments in what we're doing, whatever level we're at.
Yeah, that is a really great question. On our website, we have a few webinars that have focused on different assessment tools and ways to assess different aspects of community engagement. And I say aspects of community engagement because the way you may assess engaged learning on your campuses may be a little bit different than you may assess like community partnerships. You may have a survey at the beginning of a project, and then you may have like a survey at the end of the project or something like that. Or some schools utilize assessment through having, I think someone talked about like community advisory boards or councils. That's one way that they've received feedback and assessed the temperature in regards to community identified needs. I think someone shared this morning that they utilize collaboratories. Some people utilize GivePulse to track the data in regards to how many projects and hours and students and faculty and staff are involved. So a lot of information is on our website on webinars to kind of show you how to do that. Also, we have sample applications from previous cycles. And so you can look at applications from 2024, 2020, and they're from different institutional types. And you can kind of see how different institutions approach it. I will say that institutionalizing assessment is hard. It takes a long time to really do that. And so in a lot of ways you kind of see, I don't want to say hodgepodge, because it's not in a bad way. It's just different pathways in regards to getting the full story of assessment. And so our sample applications are online. They can show you different ways in which you can do that. And I will say it's a space for growth and development for us. One of the things that we created recently through the leadership of Elaine Ward at Merrimack University is she launched a research collab. And one of the things is assessment and how the institutions do it, as well as like what are the different terms that we use in the field, because there's just so many terms, like I can't keep up with the acronyms myself at this point. And so she's also working with a team to research, what are the different ways in regards to assessment and how it's evolving. And so those are some of the ways and pathways in which we're trying to elevate the field in that space. I will say once the 2026 cycle concludes, with Elaine's work, there will be more white papers coming out and articles that talk about assessment and its importance in this field. So stay tuned for that. But we do have some things now, but we're gonna get better at that ourselves in the future too. So yeah, but please go on the website, like download whatever you want. We have so many videos and so many resources. And if you're looking and you're like, I can't find it, as some folks know in the room, just email me. And I'll connect you with someone in the field that may know too. Yeah.
I want to echo again, thank you so much for the communities that you have made evident to us across the nation and from different institutional communities that you're coming from and representing. As someone who grew up around UT Austin, fellow Texan in the house, hey. So I'm really curious, you were labeling all of the perks of being all of these different minority serving institutions and the qualifiers and whatnot. And to some extent, I was curious about recognizing that even in our attempts to undo racial harm, we still, for better or for worse, have the cross-contamination of racism. It's kind of like saying, hey, here's chocolate, but by the way, if you're allergic to peanuts, this chocolate was made in a peanut factory. And so recognizing that you can be a Hispanic serving institution, but also still a white supreme serving institution, still a settler colonial institution, and just wondering what kind of ways of making those practices still visible for the admin, the institutions, but then also even down to the students, recognizing that a room full of students of color can still replicate racial and colonial harm.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it was something that for this 2026 cycle we really leaned into, because one of the realities of the history of higher education is that it's caused harm. It's caused harm to communities, it's caused harm to communities of color, and we're still dealing with an elitist space in a lot of ways. And so one of the ways in which we are trying to answer that is through the data that we're going to collect in the 2026 cycle. It first comes with acknowledgement and accountability. And so in our section 2, which you can look at on our website, section 2 of the framework literally directly asks how are institutions holding themselves accountable in regards to supporting marginalized communities, and not just saying you support, but in what ways do you enact it? How do you provide a space for community partners to be involved? What does community voice look like? How do you constantly assess community voice? How do you create programs and initiatives in partnership with community voice? So these are very direct. I would say in the past, we have not asked that before, but because I had a committee of individuals from minority serving institutions, they were like, we need to be very direct at this point. And so we did. And we also ask about resources, and not just enough of like, oh, we allow for a space for you to utilize on campus. No, do you allow for them to take classes? Are they allowed to teach? Are they allowed opportunities, yes, to utilize resources on campus? Do you provide grants? What kind of funding do you provide? What career pathways do you provide for them? So in our application for 2026, I feel like we're going to get a lot of data from institutions, and in a lot of ways in our application, people use it as a framework of like, this is the direction the field needs to go. And so a lot of institutions are realizing that it's not just enough to say that we create pipelines for marginalized individuals to be involved in the community. You need to think about funding, support, mentorship, sponsorship. You got to break down those barriers, and in order to do that, you have to be honest first. And not every institution is comfortable with that. And so that's where all of you are here. But, I don't want to put the burden on minority faculty and staff to do that work, but it is us in a lot of ways that push for those narratives to change within our institutions. So I think we're definitely taking a stand in 2026 to hold institutions accountable, and not just saying, give us a breakdown of your disaggregated data of how many faculty, staff, and students of color are on your campus. It's like, okay, so what are you doing to support them, to sustain, to recruit? What are your recruitment practices? And how do you share that information on campus and in the community is important too. So and also in another way, providing pathways for those individuals to be on panels and conversations at the national level. So for me, I've been very intentional on how diverse our webinars have been. Like my wonderful colleagues at FIU or on one, they did that for me. Like, I'm really intentional about who's on the panel. So in a lot of ways, we have to model it so that the field can follow as well. So I'm really proud that we've been very intentional with those practices for these recent 2 or 3 years. I think we're over time though. Yeah, okay. All right. Thank you so much.
We're going to take about a 10-minute break. We'll get about 5-minute break, and we'll get the second panel going. So I hope you stick around, and we'll get started in a few. Thank you.